Get me out of here and I'll make you a rich man, Audra Royce hissed, her voice a blade of sound in the sudden, deafening silence. The promise, a tool she had wielded to build an empire of ruthless efficiency, echoed uselessly in the cavernous dark. One moment, the ancient fluorescent lights of the Oakhaven Mill's main floor had been casting long, sickly shadows. The next, a deep, final groan from the building's guts, and then nothing. Only the shriek of the blizzard outside, a sound like tearing metal. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the armor of her composure. Audra Royce did not do panic. She created it in boardrooms and across negotiation tables. At 35, she was the cleaner, the woman Sterling Thorne Capital sent in when a company needed to be stripped for parts, its assets liquidated, its human capital rendered into a neat, acceptable loss on a balance sheet. The Oakhaven Mill was supposed to be her masterpiece, the final, bloody feather in her cap that would secure her partnership. She'd flown into this forgotten Rust Belt town this morning, her mind already 3 steps ahead, calculating severance packages and auction values. She'd walked the floor with the doomed plant manager, her heels clicking an arrogant rhythm on the worn concrete, ignoring the hostile stares of the workers. Their faces were a blur of insignificance. Now, she was trapped. The blizzard, which the news had called a significant weather event, had descended with shocking speed, burying the town, sealing the roads, and killing the power grid. Her multi-$1,000 satellite phone, held high in a trembling hand, showed one infuriating icon. No signal. "Did you hear me?" she demanded, spinning around. "There's a generator, right? A backup system. Get it running." The man she spoke to didn't move. He stood near the massive, silent looms, a solid shape in the gloom, barely visible in the faint emergency light glowing above a distant exit sign. The janitor. She'd seen him earlier, mopping a spill, his face as gray and unremarkable as the concrete floor. He was a part of the building, a fixture she had mentally slated for demolition along with the rest of it. Lyndon Callum looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim red light. He was tall, with the broad-shouldered build of a man used to physical work, his features plain but etched with a quiet weariness that seemed older than his 30-something years. "The generators in the sub-basement. Fuel lines are probably frozen solid by now. The backup system kicked on for a minute, then died. Old wiring." His voice was calm, annoyingly calm. It was the voice of a man stating a fact, not a man grappling with a crisis. "Then unfreeze them," Audra snapped, the fear inside her sharpening her tone to a razor's edge. "That's your job, isn't it? To maintain this place? I need to make a call. My career, millions of dollars, are hanging on a call I was supposed to make an hour ago." He finally moved, not toward the sub-basement, but to a nearby wall where a metal box was mounted. He pulled a heavy-duty flashlight from a clip on his belt and clicked it on. The powerful beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the swirling dust motes in the air. "My job is to clean the floors and empty the trash, ma'am. Nobody's maintained this place for real in 20 years. They just patched it up enough to keep the machines running." He ran the beam of light along the ceiling, revealing a spider web of cracks in the plaster and a dark, ominous stain that spoke of a long leaking roof. "This building is dying. You should know. You're the one who signed the death certificate." The directness of the accusation struck her silent for a beat. The people she dealt with spoke in coded language, in subtext and legalese. They didn't speak the plain, ugly truth. "My name is Audra Royce," she said, forcing the words through clenched teeth, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. "I am the senior vice president from Sterling Thorne, and I am telling you to find a way to get the power back on." "I know who you are," Lyndon said, his voice still maddeningly even. He turned the flashlight beam onto her, and she flinched, momentarily blinded. He was studying her expensive wool coat, her Italian leather boots, the sheer, out-of-place luxury of her presence. "And I'm telling you, Ms. Royce, that the power isn't coming back on. Not tonight. Maybe not tomorrow. The whole county is dark." He clicked the flashlight off her face. "The real problem isn't the lights. It's the heat. It's already dropping in here. By midnight, it'll be below freezing. By morning." He didn't need to finish. The cold was already seeping through her coat. A damp, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the storm and everything to do with the ancient, uninsulated bones of the factory. "My offer stands," she said, her voice a low growl. $50,000, cash. Get me a signal. Get me out of here. You have a family? A kid? Think of what you could do with that money." It was her trump card, the ace she played when logic and threats failed. Money always worked. Lyndon was quiet for a long moment. The only sound was the howling wind and the faint, rhythmic creak of the roof beams, settling under the weight of the snow. "I have a daughter," he said finally, his voice softer now. "Her name is Clara, and right now, all the money in the world doesn't matter as much as the 2 emergency blankets and the thermos of soup I've got in my locker. You're welcome to share, but you're going to have to stop giving orders and start listening." He turned and began walking away, his flashlight beam bobbing ahead of him, leaving her alone in the vast, encroaching darkness of the main floor. For the first time in her adult life, Audra Royce was not in control. She was cold, she was trapped, and her survival was in the hands of a man she had considered less than nothing. Swallowing the acidic taste of pure fury, she hurried to follow the light. His footsteps were steady on the concrete, a slow, unhurried rhythm that grated on Audra's raw nerves. Each echo in the vast space seemed to mock the frantic thrumming of her own heart. Following him felt like a surrender, a concession she had never made in her life. She was Audra Royce. People followed her, but the cold was a physical presence now, wrapping its tendrils around her ankles, crawling up her spine. The flashlight beam was a singular point of hope in a world that had shrunk to a terrifying pitch-black box. He led her away from the main factory floor, through a set of heavy double doors, and down a narrow cinder-block hallway. He stopped at a plain steel door marked Custodial and unlocked it with a key from the large ring clipped to his belt. The room was small, no bigger than the walk-in closet in her Chicago penthouse, and it smelled of industrial cleaner, damp wool, and something surprisingly pleasant, like cinnamon. A single emergency light, identical to the one in the main hall, cast a weak, reddish glow over the space. It was cluttered but orderly. Shelves were lined with cleaning supplies. A mop and bucket stood in one corner, and a row of gray metal lockers lined the opposite wall. This was his world. The thought was dismissive, but it lacked its usual conviction. Her world was floor-to-ceiling windows, polished chrome, and minimalist art. This was a world of scuffed linoleum and practicality. Lyndon went to one of the lockers, the middle one, and worked the combination lock. Taped to the door was a child's drawing, done in bright, waxy crayon. It depicted a smiling stick figure with a huge mop, standing in front of a building that looked like a castle. In wobbly, multicolored letters, it said, "Daddy the King of the Castle." Audra looked away, a strange heat rising in her cheeks. It felt like she was intruding on something deeply private. Lyndon pulled the locker open. Inside, alongside a neatly folded change of clothes, was a thick plaid wool blanket and a large, old-fashioned silver thermos. He set the thermos on a small, battered table, then handed her the blanket. "Here," he said. "It's not much, but it'll help." The wool was coarse against her fingertips, a world away from the cashmere throws scattered around her apartment. But as she wrapped it around her shoulders, its simple, honest warmth was immediate and profound. She sank into the room's only chair, a rickety wooden thing with a flattened cushion, pulling the blanket tight. He opened the thermos, and the smell of cinnamon and tomato filled the small space. He poured the steaming liquid into the thermos's plastic cap and handed it to her. "Tomato soup. My daughter insists it keeps the monsters away." Audra took it without a word, her fingers wrapping around the cap, chasing the warmth. The soup was rich and hot, and as she drank, it began to extinguish the cold fire of panic in her chest. She watched as Lyndon pulled a small black walkie-talkie from his locker. He pressed a button on the side, and it crackled to life. "Starlight! You there? Over." His voice was completely different now. The flat, weary tone was gone, replaced by a warmth that seemed to fill the entire room. A burst of static, and then a little girl's voice, clear as a bell. "Daddy, I'm here. Is the lady okay? Grandma said the whole town went dark. Over." "The lady's fine, sweet pea. Just cold. We're having some of your monster-away soup. Over." Audra froze, the plastic cup halfway to her lips. She could hear the girl giggle on the other end. "See? I told you it works. Did you tell her it has extra cinnamon? That's the magic part. Over. I'll be sure to let her know. How are you feeling, Clara? Is your chest being good?" Over. There was a slight pause. "It's okay. Grandma helped me with the machine before bed. I miss you. Is the castle okay? Is it scared of the storm?" Over. The castle. The drawing on the locker door. Audra's gaze flickered back to it. "The castle's fine, Starlight," Lyndon said, his voice soft. "It's old and tough, just like your daddy. It'll be here in the morning, I promise. Now, you get some sleep. I'll check in again in a few hours. I love you to the moon and back. Over and out." "Love you more," the little voice chirped, followed by a final crackle of static. Lyndon set the radio down gently, his face still soft with the memory of his daughter's voice. The silence that fell was different now. It was heavier, filled with the things Audra had just learned. A daughter named Clara, a breathing machine, a man who called his place of work a castle to make his child feel safe. "She has asthma?" Audra asked, the question coming out quieter than she intended. "Cystic fibrosis," Lyndon corrected, his expression becoming guarded again as he turned back to her. "The air quality in these old mill towns? It's not kind to little lungs." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The unspoken accusation hung in the air between them. The companies that came and went, the toxins left behind, the health care that vanished when the jobs did. It was the part of the story her reports never covered. She cleared her throat, pushing the uncomfortable thought away, forcing herself back to the problem at hand. "Okay, we have a temporary solution," she gestured with the cup. "But we need a real one. There must be blueprints for this facility, a structural map. If we can identify the weakest points, we can find the most secure location to wait for rescue." Lyndon looked at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. "Blueprints? Ma'am, the last set of updated plans are from 1982. They're in a file cabinet that's probably buried under 2 feet of snow in the administration office, 100 yards from here." "Then you'll have to be the map," she pressed, a hint of her old command returning. "Where is the most structurally sound part of this building?" He took a slow sip of soup from his own cup, his eyes never leaving hers. He seemed to be weighing something. "The safest place was the boiler room. It's in the central core of the old building, poured concrete, reinforced steel, built to withstand an explosion." "Was?" Audra picked up on the word instantly. "Why was?" The wind outside gave a sudden, violent shriek, and somewhere deep in the factory, something heavy groaned and shifted. Audra's head snapped toward the sound. Lyndon's gaze drifted upward. "Because the floor above it is the weaving room. 3 dozen antique looms, each weighing about 4 tons. They're sitting on a floor that hasn't been inspected in a decade, supported by beams that have been exposed to moisture for years." He looked back at her, his eyes grim. "And right now, there's about 3 feet of wet, heavy snow piling up on the roof directly above them. If that roof goes, it's going to pancake the whole section." Audra stared at him, the last of her bravado turning to ice in her veins. He wasn't just the janitor. He wasn't just a map. He was the only thing that stood between her and being crushed under the weight of the very factories she had come here to kill. The words hung in the frigid air, more chilling than the storm itself. Pancake the whole section. Audra's mind, a machine trained to calculate risk and leverage, tried to process the information. It spit out a single, terrifying result: catastrophic failure. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin feeling tight and cold. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. "You're certain?" she managed, her voice a dry whisper. "I've watched that leak in the roof get worse for 5 years," Lyndon said, his voice grim. "Management said it wasn't in the budget to fix. Every time we had a heavy rain, I'd have to put buckets out under it. This isn't rain, Ms. Royce. It's a few tons of ice and snow. That roof was never built for this kind of load." He was no longer looking at her with guarded patience. He was looking at her like she was a liability, another problem he had to solve. And for the first time, she saw herself that way too. Her expensive coat was a joke. Her sharp business acumen was useless. In this place, under these conditions, she was dead weight. "So we can't stay here," she stated, the obviousness of it sounding absurd. "This room it's on the ground floor of the main building." "Exactly," he said. "We need to move." "Move where?" The question was a plea. All her internal maps had vanished, replaced by the single, horrifying image of a collapsing roof. "There's an annex they built in the 70s for the finishing department. It's a single-story structure, separate roof line, better insulated. The old foreman's office up there is small, on an outside wall. If anything comes down, it'll be the main building. We'll be clear of the collapse zone." It was a plan. A real, logical plan. Relief warred with the terror. "Let's go, now." Lyndon nodded, grabbing the thermos and a second, smaller flashlight from his locker. He handed the new light to her. "Stay close behind me. The floor's uneven in places and there's equipment everywhere. Don't touch anything." Stepping out of the relative safety of the janitor's room was like plunging back into a nightmare. The main floor of the mill was a forest of silent, hulking machinery. The beam of her flashlight cut feeble paths through the oppressive dark, glinting off steel and brass. The wind howled a mournful song through the building's broken panes, and with every powerful gust, the entire structure seemed to shudder. "Why do you stay here, Callum?" Audra asked, her voice tight as she navigated around a massive, sheet-draped machine. The question was a distraction, a way to fill the terrifying silence. "It's a job," he answered simply, not slowing down. "There are other jobs, other towns. A man with your skills could surely find something better than being the last man in a dying factory." He stopped for a moment, turning to shine his light on the machine she had just passed. He pulled back the sheet. It was a loom, but unlike the others, it had intricate brass fittings and a complex series of gears that looked more like the inside of a clock. "My great-grandfather designed this one, patented the self-threading shuttle mechanism in 1928. It revolutionized the whole industry for a while." He ran a hand over the cold metal, a gesture of familiarity, almost reverence. "My grandfather ran this mill. My father worked this floor for 40 years. When the last buyout happened, they offered him a pension or a janitorial contract for me. He chose the contract, said a Callum should always be here to turn the lights off." His laugh was a short, bitter sound. "Guess he got his wish." Audra said nothing. Her own grandfather had given her a portfolio of stocks on her 18th birthday with a note that read, "Don't disappoint me." Family, in her world, was another form of pressure, another expectation to be met or exceeded. "Clara's doctors are in Albany," Lyndon continued, as if sensing her unspoken question. "It's a 2-hour drive, but they're the best. We have a routine. Her school is good. The people here, they look out for us. You can't just pack that up and move. Some things are more important than a bigger paycheck." He gave her a pointed look. "Besides, the health care plan that came with this job is the only reason I can afford her medicine." A job she was here to eliminate. A health care plan she was about to render void. The soup churned in her stomach. 200 miles away, in a sleek Manhattan office overlooking the storm-lashed city, Dalton Creed swirled a glass of scotch. He was on a video call, his face a mask of calculated concern. "Absolutely reckless, Judith," he was saying to the face on his screen, a senior board member of Sterling Thorne. The weather advisories were clear. For Audra to go in person, to make herself unreachable on the very day the final report was due, it shows a shocking lack of judgment. Judith, a woman with iron-gray hair and an expression to match, looked unconvinced. "Audra is aggressive, Dalton. It's what we pay her for. She closes deals." "She closes factories," Dalton corrected smoothly. "There's a difference. This Oak Haven deal was supposed to be a formality. Instead, she's made it a liability. The press will have a field day if word gets out one of our VPs is missing in a blizzard after firing an entire town. I'm just saying, perhaps the partnership decision should be postponed. We need leadership that is stable, predictable." He took a slow sip of his scotch, letting the word predictable hang in the air. He knew Judith hated surprises. They reached the annex. It felt marginally warmer, the wind's howl slightly more muffled. Lyndon led her up a short flight of metal stairs to a small office, a glass-walled cube that overlooked the silent finishing department. The office was a time capsule. A thick film of dust covered everything. A chunky beige computer sat on the desk next to a rotary phone. A calendar on the wall was permanently turned to August 1998. Pinned to a corkboard were faded snapshots of men and women in work clothes, smiling, holding up awards, gathered around a birthday cake. Generations of lives, lived and forgotten, right here in this room. Lyndon wiped the desk with his sleeve, setting down the thermos. "We'll be safer here. For now." Audra wrapped the blanket tighter, the faces in the photos staring back at her like ghosts. These were the people she'd reduced to numbers on a page, to collateral damage in a corporate war they didn't even know was being fought. And then they heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a deep, guttural roar from the direction of the main building. A sound of immense pressure and catastrophic release. It was the shriek of metal tearing, of ancient timbers splintering, followed by a deafening, rolling crash that shook the very foundation of the annex. Dust and ice crystals rained down from the ceiling of the office. Lyndon grabbed her, pulling her away from the glass wall as they both stared into the darkness, toward the source of the sound. The crashing stopped, replaced by an unnerving silence. "What was that?" Audra breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Lyndon's face was pale in the flashlight's glow. "That," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "was the roof." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The silence that followed the crash was somehow louder and more terrifying than the noise itself. It was the sound of a void, of something immense that had once been there and now wasn't. Audra could feel the vibration of the impact in the soles of her feet, a deep thrum that traveled up her legs and settled like a stone in her stomach. Her mind, which had been racing, went completely blank. Lyndon was the first to break the stillness. He reached out and grabbed the back of her chair, his knuckles white. "Stay here," he breathed, his voice tight with an urgency that sent a fresh wave of ice through her veins. He crept to the glass wall of the office, keeping low, and peered out into the darkness of the annex. After a few seconds, he gave a slight nod, seemingly satisfied that their immediate structure was holding. But his calm was gone. The steady, unflappable man had been replaced by someone who looked just as terrified as she felt. And the first thing he did was snatch the walkie-talkie off the desk. His hands were shaking. "Starlight! Clara, can you hear me? Come in, Starlight, over!" His voice cracked on her name. The static that answered felt like an eternity. Audra found herself holding her breath, her own fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a desperate need to hear the little girl's voice. "Daddy?" The voice was small, trembling. "Daddy, what was that noise? It was a big bang. Grandma jumped and the windows shook. Are you okay? Over." Lyndon closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping in a wave of pure relief that was painful to watch. He took a deep, shuddering breath before pressing the button to speak. Just the storm, sweet pea. The wind is making a lot of noise in the old castle. Nothing to worry about. I'm perfectly safe. Over. The lie was immense, but his tone was a masterpiece of paternal reassurance. He was building a wall of calm words around his daughter, protecting her from a terror he was living through. It sounded like a giant fell down, Clara's voice replied. A little stronger now. Grandma is making hot chocolate with marshmallows. She says it's good for when you're scared. Are you scared, Daddy? Over. Audra watched Lyndon's throat work as he swallowed. He leaned his forehead against the cold glass of the office wall. Nope, not a bit. He lied again. Your daddy's too tough to be scared, but I'll tell you what. You have an extra marshmallow for me, okay? For courage. Over. Okay, Daddy. A big one. Be careful. Over and out. He stood there for a long time after the static returned, his back to Audra. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the slight tremor in his hands as he clipped the radio back to his belt. He was just a man, a father, terrified that he wouldn't make it home to his little girl. All the anger, all the frustration she had felt toward him, evaporated. It was a feeling like a fever breaking, leaving her feeling weak but strangely clear. She sounds strong, Audra said, her own voice husky, like her father. Lyndon turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. He seemed surprised by the sincerity in her tone. He gave a small, sad smile. She's the strong one. I'm just faking it. I know, Audra admitted. Me too. The admission felt monumental. It was the first honest thing she'd said since the storm hit. A fragile bridge of shared humanity had just been built between them in the dusty, forgotten office. We need to see, he said, his voice regaining some of its practical edge. We need to know what we're dealing with. He led the way out of the office and down the metal steps. They moved cautiously along the wall of the annex, toward the wide, arching doorway that connected to the main factory. The air grew colder, thick with the smell of wet plaster and something else, the clean, sharp scent of the blizzard itself. They stopped at the threshold. Lyndon shone his light into the cavernous space, and Audra's breath caught in her throat. It was a scene of absolute devastation. A huge section of the roof, at least 100 feet long, had given way completely. A mountain of snow, twisted steel beams, and shattered timbers lay in a massive heap on the factory floor. The very looms Lyndon's great-grandfather had designed were crushed and mangled, barely recognizable under the debris. A gaping hole now opened to the sky, and snow was whipping in, piling up on the wreckage. The path they had taken from the janitor's room was completely gone, buried under tons of rubble. My God, Audra whispered. We were right under that. The collapse took out the west wall support columns, Lyndon said, his flashlight beam tracing the line of destruction. That whole section of the building is unstable now. The wall between here and there? He pointed to the cinder block wall that separated the main building from their annex. It won't hold if there's a secondary collapse. The fragile sense of safety they'd found in the office vanished. They hadn't escaped the danger. They had just moved into a different part of the trap. So we're cut off, Audra said, her mind racing again, but differently this time. It wasn't about anger or blame. It was about survival. His locker, the soup, the blankets, they're all on the other side of that. Yeah, Lyndon said grimly. We've got what we're carrying, and that's it. She stared at the wall, then around the annex. Her strategist's brain, dormant for hours, flickered to life. When I did the walkthrough this morning, she said slowly, the plant manager mentioned an old conveyor system for moving finished textiles from this department to the old loading bay. He said it was decommissioned years ago, completely walled off, but he pointed it out. On that wall. She aimed her flashlight at the far wall of the annex, away from the collapse. There was nothing there but a long, flat expanse of painted cinder block. Lyndon followed her beam, his brow furrowed. The Carter system. Yeah, they boxed it in during the 90s. Said it was cheaper than tearing it out. It runs through the Foundation crawl space. Does it go all the way to the other side of the building? Audra pressed. Beyond the collapse? He thought for a moment. The old loading bay. That's on the far east side. The structure there is different. Reinforced concrete from the original build. It would have held. His eyes widened slightly as he understood. You're thinking we can get into the conveyor tunnel? It's a path, isn't it? She challenged. A way through, not just back. A way out. He looked from the impassive cinderblock wall to the horrifying wreckage in the main building. Then back to her. The idea was insane. Breaking into a walled-off, decades-old tunnel in the dark, with no idea of its condition. But it was also the only idea they had. There's a maintenance hatch, he said, the words coming slowly. Behind some old shelving units over there. I haven't seen it opened in 20 years. They stood there, two wildly different people from two different worlds, staring at a blank wall. It was a desperate, terrifying gamble. Stay put and wait for the building to crush them, or crawl into a dark, unknown hole, and pray it led to safety. 20 years is a long time, Audra stated, her voice flat. It could be collapsed, flooded, anything. It could be, Lyndon agreed, his gaze fixed on the blank cinderblock wall. He looked back at the gaping maw where the main hall used to be, where snow was now drifting over crushed machinery. But we know what's happening back there. I'll take my chances with the unknown. It was the grim logic of survival. The choice between a certain death and a possible one. For Audra, who had spent her life mitigating risk and ensuring predictable outcomes, the uncertainty was a special kind of hell. But he was right. Okay, she said, her voice firm. A decision made. Let's get to work. A flicker of surprise crossed Lyndon's face, a grudging respect. He nodded toward a looming wall of industrial metal shelving, laden with dusty, forgotten machine parts and chemical drums labeled with faded warnings. The hatch should be behind that. For the next 20 minutes, they worked in a focused, desperate silence. The shelving unit was immense and impossibly heavy. They pushed, grunted, and strained together, their breath misting in the frigid air. Audra's arms, accustomed to lifting nothing heavier than a legal brief, screamed in protest. Her hands, usually protected by leather gloves, were raw and scraped. But she didn't stop. With a final synchronized heave, the unit scraped away from the wall, revealing a small, square metal plate set into the concrete, barely a foot off the floor. It was secured with a heavy, rusted wheel handle. Lyndon knelt and gripped the wheel, pulling with all his weight. It didn't budge. The metal was fused with rust. It seized. Let me try, Audra said, kneeling beside him. They both gripped the wheel, their hands brushing against each other's. They pulled together, muscles straining, teeth gritted. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a piercing screech of tortured metal, the wheel gave way, turning a few inches. They worked at it, taking turns, until the hatch finally groaned open, revealing a square of perfect, impenetrable blackness. A wave of cold, stale air washed over them, carrying the scent of decay and damp earth. Our way out, Audra murmured, though it looked more like the entrance to a tomb. I'll go first, Lyndon said, wasting no time. He shone his flashlight into the opening. The beam was swallowed by the dark, revealing only the first few feet of a narrow, metal-lined tunnel, just big enough for a person to crawl through. An old, rubber conveyor belt lay on the floor like a dead serpent. You keep your light on the opening. Give me a minute, then follow. Don't get more than 10 feet behind me. He swung his legs into the hole and shimmied forward, disappearing into the black. Audra was left alone in the annex, her small light pushing back against the immense darkness. The silence pressed in. After what felt like a lifetime, but was probably only 30 seconds, his voice echoed faintly from the tunnel. Okay, it's clear so far. Come on. Taking a steadying breath, Audra Royce, the woman who dined with billionaires and dismantled corporations, got on her hands and knees and crawled into the dirt. The claustrophobia was immediate and overwhelming. The tunnel was barely 3 feet high. The cold metal walls seemed to press in on her, and the air was thick with the smell of rust. The only sounds were the scrape of her knees on the gritty floor, her own ragged breathing, and Lyndon's steady progress somewhere ahead. "If we get out of this," she said, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space, "that $50,000 offer still stands." His voice came back from the darkness ahead. "What would a person like you do with $50,000, Ms. Royce?" The question caught her off guard. She'd always seen money as a tool, a weapon, a scorecard. She'd never thought of it in terms of what it could do for a single person. "I don't know. Put it in an index fund. Buy a watch." "A watch?" He sounded genuinely baffled. "What about you, Callum?" she asked, turning the question back on him. "What would you do with it?" "Get Clara's name on the list for a new trial therapy," he answered without a second's hesitation. "It's experimental, but the doctors think it could really help her lungs. Costs a fortune just to be considered." He paused. "I'd fix the roof on my house, and I'd take her to the ocean. She's never seen it. She wants to know if it really tastes like salt." Audra pictured her own life. The sterile white walls of her penthouse. The view of Lake Michigan she never really looked at. The last vacation she'd taken had been a mandatory wellness retreat her company had sent her on, and she'd spent the whole time on conference calls. The chasm between their two lives was so vast it made her dizzy. They crawled onward. The minutes bled together into a timeless agony of cold, darkness, and aching muscles. Then, Lyndon stopped. "What is it?" she asked, her heart jumping. "Problem," he said. His flashlight beam was angled downward. Ahead of them, the tunnel dipped, and the floor was submerged in a pool of black, still water. "How deep is it?" "Looks like a foot, maybe more. A pipe must have burst during the collapse. It's going to be cold." There was no way around it. He pushed forward, hissing as the freezing water soaked through his jeans and jacket. Audra watched, horrified, then followed, a gasp escaping her lips as the icy water shocked her system. It felt like being stabbed by 1,000 frozen needles. The cold was absolute, seeping into her bones, stealing what little warmth she had left. They pushed through, the water sloshing around them. It was the most miserable experience of her life. They finally emerged on the other side, gasping and shivering uncontrollably, their clothes plastered to their skin. They were soaked, exhausted, and the life-threatening chill was setting in fast. Lyndon slumped against the wall of the tunnel, his breathing labored. "We have to rest for a minute." Audra collapsed beside him, her own body shaking so hard her teeth chattered. They switched off their lights to conserve the batteries, plunging them into a total, disorienting blackness. It was in that absolute silence, deep in the guts of the earth, that they heard it. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the groaning of the building. It came from somewhere up ahead in the tunnel, a faint, rhythmic sound. Scrape, drip, scrape. It was quiet, but undeniable. Audra's blood ran cold. The sound was methodical. It wasn't the sound of a building settling. It was the sound of something moving. Scrape, drip, scrape. The sound cut through the absolute blackness, methodical and unnervingly close. Audra's exhausted mind conjured images of something dragging itself through the tunnel, something that belonged in the dark. Beside her, she could feel Lyndon tense up, his shivering momentarily ceasing as he strained to listen. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling so hard the words were barely distinct. "I don't know," he whispered back. "Water, maybe." Shifting debris. But his tone lacked conviction. The scraping sound was too rhythmic, too consistent to be random. Fear was a potent motivator. It cleared the fog of exhaustion from Audra's mind. Staying here, defenseless in the dark, was not an option. "Turn on your light," she ordered, her voice regaining a sliver of its old authority. Lyndon didn't argue. He clicked on his flashlight, and the powerful beam shot down the narrow tunnel. The light revealed nothing but the same rusted metal walls and the grimy conveyor belt stretching into the darkness. But the sound was clearer now. Scrape, drip, scrape. "It's coming from around that bend," he said, his voice low. "There's no choice. We have to go toward it." They began to crawl again, their movements slow and agonizing. Every muscle screamed in protest. The wet, icy fabric of their clothes chafed their skin, and the cold had sunk so deep it felt like it was part of their bones. As they rounded a gentle curve in the tunnel, the source of the sound came into view. And it was so mundane, so utterly ordinary, that it was almost more terrifying than any monster she could have imagined. Ahead of them, a hairline fracture in the concrete foundation, likely caused by the shock of the collapse, had allowed a tiny stream of groundwater to seep through. The water was dripping steadily from the ceiling onto a loose metal panel on the floor. Drip, drip, drip. The scraping sound came from an old maintenance cart, little more than a rusty metal tray on wheels, that sat on a parallel service track. A powerful draft, sucked in from the new fissure, was pushing the cart, causing one of its rusted wheels to scrape rhythmically against the track as it rocked back and forth. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was nothing. A leak and a draft. Relief washed over Audra so intensely it made her feel weak. She let out a shaky laugh that sounded more like a sob. Lyndon crawled forward, examining the fissure. "Fresh air," he said, a note of wonder in his voice. He pointed his light up. The fissure ran up the wall to an old ventilation grate. "The collapse must have unblocked part of the shaft. It won't be big enough to get out, but it was a connection to the outside world, a reminder that it still existed." The relief, however, was fleeting. As the adrenaline faded, Audra's body began to betray her. The shivering, which had been violent, started to subside, replaced by a dull, creeping numbness. Her movements became clumsy, her thoughts sluggish. "We need to keep moving," Lyndon said, turning back to her. He saw her face in the beam of his light, the bluish tint to her lips, the glassy look in her eyes. "Miss Royce? Audra?" She tried to answer, but her tongue felt thick and heavy. "So cold, I know. Hypothermia is setting in," he said, his voice sharp with alarm. "You have to get up. You have to move. If you stop now, you won't start again." He scrambled back to her, grabbing her arm. His touch, even through her wet coat, felt strangely warm. "Come on your feet. We can't crawl anymore. The tunnel looks wider ahead. We have to walk. We have to generate heat." He hauled her up. Her legs were unsteady, barely able to hold her. He put his arm around her, practically holding her upright. "Walk with me. That's an order." She leaned on him, forcing one foot in front of the other. The effort was colossal. Her body screamed for rest, for the simple oblivion of sleep. "Can't," she mumbled. "Yes, you can," he insisted, his voice harsh with fear. He began rubbing her arm vigorously, trying to force circulation. "Think about something else, something warm, a memory." Her mind drifted, foggy and disconnected. A memory surfaced, strangely vivid. She was 10 years old, standing beside a swimming pool at dawn, the water a shockingly cold sheet of blue. Her father stood beside her, stopwatch in hand. "Pain is a weakness of the mind, Audra," his voice echoed in her memory. "You want to win? You swim until you can't feel the cold." "I won the race," she murmured, the words slurring. "He bought me stock." Lyndon looked at her, his face a mixture of confusion and pity. "Just keep walking," he urged, pulling her forward into the darkness. "Just a little further." Dalton Creed smiled. The CEO, Mr. Abernathy, had just gotten off the phone with him. "You've done well, Dalton," the old man had said. "Proactive. That's what we need. With Royce incapacitated, we need you to take point on the Oakhaven liquidation. Handle it." Dalton had already handled it. He'd drafted the press release expressing deep concern for their missing VP, while simultaneously announcing an accelerated and decisive new direction for the Oakhaven assets. He was dismantling her career with the same brutal efficiency she had once been famous for. He poured himself another scotch. It tasted like victory. They stumbled through the dark, a single unit bound by desperation. Audra was only vaguely aware of her own movements. Her existence narrowed to Lyndon's voice, and the steady pressure of his arm keeping her from collapsing. He kept talking to her, asking her questions, forcing her to engage her sluggish mind. He asked about her job, her apartment, her life, and she answered with disjointed, delirious honesty, shedding the secrets of her lonely, structured life like layers of unwanted clothing. The tunnel was widening, just as he'd said. They were able to walk almost upright now. Their flashlights, used sparingly, were growing dimmer. The batteries were dying.
"Lyndon,"
she whispered, her head lolling against his shoulder.
"I don't think I can."
"Yes, you can," he said, his own voice raspy with exhaustion. "We're almost there."
"There,"
she mumbled. "Where? I don't know, but we're almost there." He stopped, holding his flashlight up. The beam was weak, a pale yellow circle, but it illuminated something ahead. It wasn't the end of the tunnel. It was a ladder, bolted to the wall, leading up to another maintenance hatch in the ceiling, and at the base of the ladder, something was glinting. A small metallic object, reflecting the last dying light of his flashlight. It was a thermos, silver and old-fashioned, with a small dent in the side. It was the thermos from his locker. The silver thermos sat at the base of the steel ladder, a small, impossible beacon in the dying light. Audra blinked, certain the cold was making her hallucinate. It couldn't be there. The locker room where Lyndon had left it was on the other side of a mountain of twisted steel and snow. "I'm seeing things," she slurred, her voice thick. But Lyndon was staring at it, his face a mask of disbelief. He stumbled forward and knelt, touching the thermos as if to confirm it was real. It was. He unscrewed the top. A faint wisp of steam, smelling of tomato and cinnamon, curled up into the frigid air. He stared into the opening, then looked down the dark tunnel they'd come from, then back at the thermos. His logical, practical mind was at war with the object in his hands. It was an impossibility, a miracle delivered to the deep, frozen guts of the factory. "How?" Audra whispered. The single word a monumental effort. Lyndon poured a small amount of the still-warm soup into the cap and brought it to her lips. "Drink," he commanded, his voice filled with a new, urgent energy. The warmth spread through her, a slow, life-giving tide pushing back the numbness. It was more than just heat. It was hope. As she drank, Lyndon's eyes were scanning the walls of the tunnel, the floor, the ladder, searching for an answer his mind couldn't provide. And then, his gaze stopped, fixed on a series of faint, almost invisible markings on the cinder blocks next to the ladder's base. A crudely scratched arrow, and beside it, a letter C. "Clara," he breathed. His eyes widened as a memory, buried for decades, surfaced with the force of a tidal wave. His grandfather, a stoic, quiet man, showing him this very spot when he was a boy. "The mill can be a dangerous place," the old man had said, his voice raspy. "Disasters happen, fires, collapses. A smart man always builds himself a back door. Remember this spot, Lyndon. It's the way out of the castle when the front gate is locked." He'd thought it was just a game, a story his granddad told to make him feel special. He had forgotten it completely. Until now. "My grandfather," Lyndon said, his voice thick with awe. He looked at Audra, his eyes shining in the dim light. After the big fire in '62, he didn't trust the main entrances anymore. He spent a year digging. A private access tunnel. From the cellar of our house, which is just up the hill from here, connecting to this maintenance shaft, a family escape route. He ran his hand over the scratched C. "My dad sealed it up years ago, said it was foolish, attracted rodents. But he must have showed my mother, or my grandmother. They knew." He let out a shaky laugh. "My grandmother must have remembered the old stories. She brought Clara. They left this for me." Audra listened, the story filtering through the fog of her hypothermia. It was a fairy tale, a legacy not of stock portfolios and corporate takeovers, but of secret passages and a love so fierce it could find a way through concrete and earth to deliver a thermos of soup. A grandfather's foresight, a grandmother's memory, a daughter's faith. It was a form of wealth she couldn't possibly comprehend. The soup had done its work. The shivering returned. A good sign, as feeling began to seep back into her numb limbs. The clarity in her mind sharpened. Their situation was still dire, but the impossible thermos had changed the equation. They weren't just crawling blindly anymore. They were following a map left by ghosts. "The ladder," she said, her voice stronger. "The hatch. That has to be the way." The shaft leads up to a small, abandoned storage room on the surface, right behind the old dye house, Lyndon said, the pieces of his memory clicking into place. "If we can get through that hatch, we're out of the tunnel." Renewed purpose surged through them. He helped her to the base of the ladder. It was slick with condensation and slick with ice in places. "I'll go first," he said. "I'll guide your feet." The climb was brutal. Every rung was an icy, painful struggle. Audra's arms felt like lead, her legs watery and weak. But Lyndon was a steady presence above her, his voice encouraging, his hand occasionally reaching down to steady her. "That's it. One more. You're stronger than you think, Royce. You're a fighter." He was using her last name, but it sounded different now. Not like a corporate title, but like a name he respected. They reached the top, a small, precarious platform in the darkness. Above them was the hatch. It was a solid steel plate, its handle a simple recessed lever, caked in decades of grime and rust. Lyndon braced himself and pushed upward with his shoulder. The hatch didn't move. He grunted, pushing again with all his might. A groan of rusted metal, but nothing more. It was sealed tight by time and neglect. "It's no good," he gasped, slumping against the ladder. "I can't get enough leverage." They were so close. The thought of being trapped here, feet from the surface, was unbearable. Audra looked at the hatch, then at Lyndon. The image of his daughter's drawing, Daddy the king of the castle, flashed in her mind. He had done everything. He had kept her alive. Now it was her turn. With a surge of adrenaline born of pure desperation, she positioned herself beside him on the narrow platform. "Together," she said, her voice a raw command. "On 3. 1, 2, 3!" They slammed their shoulders against the cold steel in unison. There was a loud, shrieking crack as the rusted hinge finally broke its seal. The hatch lifted a fraction of an inch, letting in a sliver of shocking, brilliant gray. It was light, the pale, weak light of a blizzard-choked dawn. It was the most beautiful thing Audra had ever seen. Muffled by the door and the snow, they could hear the faint, steady howl of the wind. They were at the surface. They were alive. Prying open that last inch felt like pushing open the lid of their own tomb. The gray light was a physical blow. After so long in the subterranean darkness, the flat, diffused light of the blizzard-choked morning was blinding. A blast of wind and fine, sharp snow tore through the opening, stinging their faces. With a final, shared groan of effort, they shoved the heavy steel plate open. It fell back on its rusted hinges with a clang that was immediately swallowed by the storm. Lyndon scrambled out first, then reached back down for Audra, pulling her up and out of the shaft. They collapsed onto the snow-covered ground, gasping, their bodies screaming with a mixture of pain, exhaustion, and the sheer, shocking cold of the open air. They were out, but they had emerged into a world of white chaos. The wind was a physical force, trying to push them back down. Snow swirled so thickly that Audra couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. They were in a narrow alleyway between 2 old brick buildings, the annex and what Lyndon had called the dye house. Drifts were piled high against the walls, some reaching halfway up the buildings. "My house is just up the hill," Lyndon yelled over the roar of the wind. "Maybe 200 yards from here." 200 yards. It might as well have been 200 miles. In this whiteout, with no landmarks visible, it was a terrifyingly abstract distance. "Which way?" Audra shouted back, huddling behind him for shelter from the wind. "This way." He grabbed her hand, his grip surprisingly strong, and started pulling her along the wall of the dye house. Every step was a battle. The snow was knee-deep in most places, and in others, they plunged into drifts up to their waists. The wet clothes that had been a misery in the tunnel were now a deadly liability, freezing solid against their skin. Audra's strength was gone. She was running on nothing but the fumes of the soup and the memory of the light. After 50 yards of grueling progress, her legs gave out, and she fell face first into a snowdrift. It felt soft, quiet, so easy to just lie there, to close her eyes. "No," a voice commanded. Lyndon was there, hauling her back to her feet. She was dead weight in his arms. "I can't, Lyndon," she wept, the tears freezing on her cheeks. "I'm done. Just leave me." "I'm not leaving you," he yelled, his face inches from hers, his expression fierce. He shook her slightly. "Listen to me. We are not stopping. Not now. Clara's waiting for us. She left us that soup. She knew we were coming. We can't quit on her now. Do you hear me, Audra?" It was the first time he'd used her first name. It wasn't a corporate title or a formal address. It was a name. Her name. And in his mouth, it sounded like a challenge, a plea, and a promise all at once. Something inside her, something she thought had frozen solid, flickered with a tiny spark. She looked at him, at this man who had every reason to hate her, who was now using every last ounce of his strength to save her. The thought of Dalton Creed, sitting in his warm office, scheming to take her job, flashed through her mind. For weeks, that partnership had been the sun her entire life orbited. Now, the thought of it felt pathetic, meaningless. What was a partnership compared to this? Compared to a man fighting through a blizzard for his daughter? She nodded, a small, jerky movement. "Okay." He put her arm over his shoulder, half carrying, half dragging her forward. They moved like a single, wounded animal, battling the storm for every inch. They were guided only by Lyndon's instinct, his memory of the landscape buried beneath the white. And then, through the swirling curtain of snow, she saw it. A light. A single, warm, yellow light. It was a window. A house. "There!" Lyndon croaked, his voice raw. Hope gave them a final, impossible burst of energy. They stumbled the last few yards, collapsing against a small wooden porch, the yellow light of the window washing over them like a benediction. Before Lyndon could even reach for the doorknob, the door was thrown open. A woman stood there, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her face a road map of worried wrinkles. She was sturdy, wrapped in a thick cardigan, and held a heavy wooden spoon like a weapon. Behind her, peeking around her legs, was a small girl with wide, fearful eyes and her father's dark hair. Clara. "Lyndon!" the old woman cried, her voice a mixture of relief and fury. Lyndon collapsed to his knees on the welcome mat, heedless of the snow and cold. He didn't say a word. He just opened his arms, and Clara launched herself into them. He buried his face in her hair, his whole body shaking with silent, racking sobs. It was the sound of a man who had walked through hell and found his way back to heaven. Audra stood on the porch, swaying on her feet, a ghost witnessing a scene of love so profound, it felt holy. She had never been hugged like that. She had never seen anyone hugged like that. The grandmother's sharp eyes landed on her. She took in Audra's frozen state, the ice in her hair, the expensive but ruined suit, the blue tinge of her skin. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. "Dear Lord," she said, her voice gruff but laced with an undeniable kindness. She turned to her grandson. "Get your daughter inside, Lyndon." "And you, girl," she said, her firm hand taking Audra's arm. "Get in this house right now, before you freeze solid on my porch." She guided Audra over the threshold, into the overwhelming warmth of the small house. It smelled of wood smoke, baking bread, and hot chocolate. A fire roared in a stone hearth. It was small, cluttered, and unbelievably, painfully alive. The grandmother sat her down in a worn armchair by the fire, peeling off her frozen coat and wrapping her in a thick, handmade quilt. Lyndon was on the floor, still holding Clara, murmuring her name over and over. Clara was stroking his face, whispering, "It's okay, Daddy. You beat the storm. I knew you would." Audra Royce sat by the fire, wrapped in a stranger's quilt, in a stranger's home. She was safe. She was warm. And she had never felt so utterly and completely alone in her entire life. The grandmother's name was Elspeth, and she moved with the efficiency of a seasoned field general. While Lyndon was still kneeling on the floor, clinging to his daughter as if she were an anchor in a raging sea, Elspeth had steered Audra to the small bathroom, thrust a pile of soft, worn clothes into her arms, and ordered her into a hot shower. 5 minutes, she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. Just enough to get the blood moving. The hot water was a blissful agony on Audra's semi-numb skin. She emerged shaky, wrapped in a towel, to find Elspeth waiting with a steaming mug of rich hot chocolate. She was guided to an armchair by the roaring fire, and a thick, handmade quilt was wrapped around her shoulders. The small house, a fortress of warmth against the storm, smelled of wood smoke and simmering beef stew. It was small, cluttered, and unbelievably alive. Lyndon returned, dressed in a dry sweater, and immediately sat on the floor, pulling Clara into his lap. He didn't seem to need a chair. He just needed to be near his daughter. Elspeth ladled stew into bowls and handed one to Audra. "You're the one from the city," she said. It wasn't a question. "The one Lyndon said was in charge of the closing." Audra flinched. The word closing sounded obscene in this warm kitchen. "My name is Audra Royce," she said, the words that had defined her life now tasting like ashes. "I was there to finalize the asset liquidation." She braced herself for the anger she deserved. Instead, Elspeth just nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "And you got caught in the storm." She looked at Lyndon. "He got you out." "We got each other out," Lyndon corrected softly, not looking up. The lack of condemnation was more jarring than any attack. They were feeding her, caring for her. It made her feel infinitesimally small. In his Manhattan office, Dalton Creed was giving the performance of his career before a projection of the executive board. "In light of the catastrophic structural failure, I've activated the crisis protocol," he said smoothly. "The insurance claims are filed, assets a total loss. I'm simply cleaning up the mess." Mr. Abernathy, the CEO, nodded grimly. "Good work, Dalton." "Decisive. We'll formalize your promotion to partner at the end of the week." Dalton allowed himself a small, humble nod. He had won. Audra Royce was now just a footnote. Back in Oak Haven, a battery-operated radio murmured the news. The historic textile mill, slated for permanent closure this week, has reportedly suffered a partial roof collapse, a tragic end for a local landmark. Audra listened, a spoonful of stew halfway to her mouth. A tragic end. A messy business. That's what her life's work amounted to. She looked at the family around her. Lyndon was now reading quietly to Clara. Elspeth was knitting, her needles clicking a steady, comforting rhythm. They weren't listening to the radio. The outside world didn't matter here. What mattered was the fire, the food, the sound of a father's voice. She had fought her entire life for a prize that had just been stolen by a man who wrote her off as a casualty. And in that moment, she realized the prize was worthless. Her satellite phone, now charged, lay on an end table. It was her link back to the world she'd nearly died for. She looked at it, then at Elspeth. She stood, collected her empty bowl and Lyndon's, and carried them to the kitchen sink. Elspeth looked up, surprised. "You don't have to do that, dear." "I know," Audra said softly, and picked up a dishcloth. It was a small, simple act, but it was a choice, a decision to participate in this world, not just observe it. The storm raged outside, but for the first time in a very long while, Audra Royce felt the quiet beginnings of a calm within. The simple, meaningful work of washing the dishes settled Audra's mind. Later, after Lyndon had tucked Clara into bed, she found herself by the fire with Elspeth, whose knitting needles clicked with a steady, peaceful rhythm. "He's a good man, my Lyndon," Elspeth said, her eyes on her work. "Feels the weight of the world. My husband, Robert, was the same. He built that mill believing a business was like a family. You have to care for it, not just take from it. When the corporations took over, they forgot that. They see a place like the mill and just see scrap. They don't see the heart." She looked at Audra, her eyes kind but knowing. "You were trained to see the bottom line. It must be a cold way to live." "I was taught that empathy was a liability," Audra confessed, the words feeling foreign and shameful. "My father was a trader. He said you either win or you lose. Anything else was a weakness." Elspeth paused her knitting. "Some people think the only way to stay warm is to burn everything down around them. It's a sad kind of cold to carry." Lyndon returned and sat by the fire, a thoughtful expression on his face. The storm-rattled night passed in the quiet bubble of the small house. As the wind began to soften its howl, Lyndon spoke into the comfortable silence. "It's funny," he said, staring into the flames. "You came to assess the mill's value, but you never saw the most valuable parts. The old looms from the 40s. They were slow, but the quality of the weave was like nothing else. And the water from the creek. It was perfect for dyeing, made the colors brighter than any chemical could." He shook his head with a sad smile. "There was a man, the last dye master. All that knowledge he had, it just vanished when he retired." Audra listened, and the strategist inside her, a part of her she thought was dead, began to stir. Artisanal quality, unique materials, lost techniques. These were not sentimental ramblings. They were powerful, untapped assets. A business model began to form in her mind, not of liquidation, but of resurrection. A small, high-quality, authentic brand in a market that craved exactly that. It was an improbable, fragile idea, but it glowed with more potential than any deal she had ever chased. The storm broke just before dawn. A profound, snow-muffled silence fell over the world. Audra woke to a room filled with a pale blue light. She went to the window and looked out at a landscape reborn, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The world was still and beautiful. Lyndon came to stand beside her, holding out a mug of coffee. They stood together, watching the new day dawn. The immediate danger was over. The future, a vast and completely open question, lay before them. Audra turned from the window, her mind clear and calm. The path forward was no longer about escaping back to her old life. It was about seeing if a new one could be built from the ruins. She looked at Lyndon, her gaze direct and filled with a purpose he had never seen before. "Tell me more," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Tell me more about your great-grandfather's self-threading shuttle." Lyndon stared at her, surprised by the sharp, technical nature of the question. In the quiet, snow-blanketed morning, he began to explain the simple genius of his great-grandfather's invention. He spoke of the loom's ability to handle finer threads without breaking, a quality that enabled an artisanal craftsmanship long since abandoned for mass production. Audra listened, not as a liquidator, but as a founder. She wasn't seeing a dead factory. She was seeing a blueprint. When the plows finally cleared the main roads, Audra's satellite phone came back to life. Her first call wasn't to her office, but to her wealth manager. "Liquidate everything," she said calmly. "I have a new venture." Her second call was to Sterling Thorne's CEO. "Audra!" Mr. Abernathy's voice boomed with false relief. "We thought you were lost. Dalton has been handling the mess." "I'm sure he has," Audra replied, her voice cold steel. "I'm resigning. effective immediately. I'm also submitting a formal bid to purchase the Oakhaven Mill assets. Abernathy laughed. It's a worthless pile of rubble, Audra. It's an environmental liability that will cost you millions to clean up, she countered, using their own ruthless logic against them. My offer to take the property as is will be the most profitable deal on your desk this year. My lawyer will be in touch. She hung up, a genuine smile touching her lips for the first time in years. With her personal fortune, her first act was to make a quiet, anonymous donation to the trial therapy program at the Albany Hospital, ensuring Clara Callum would be its next recipient. Her second was to acquire the deed to the ruined mill. The weeks that followed were a blur. Audra and Lyndon, now partners, sifted through the wreckage. They salvaged the original loom mechanisms and the old patent designs. They found Pat Webb, the cynical old die master, and convinced him not with promises of profit, but with a shared vision of artistry and quality. They didn't just rebuild a factory, they resurrected a legacy, hiring townspeople and bringing back the knowledge that had been left to rust. 1 year later, the new sign read, Oakhaven Weavers. The workshop was bright and alive, the hum of the 4 restored looms a steady heartbeat in the center of town. Their small batch artisanal textiles had become a sensation, sought after by designers who valued authenticity over volume. The town had its heart back. Audra stood by a window overlooking the workshop, no longer in a power suit, but in comfortable jeans. Lyndon came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. The new shipment of wool came in, he murmured. Clara will want a new scarf for the winter. Clara, healthier and more vibrant than ever, was thriving. Audra now shared the small house on the hill with her, Lyndon, and Elspeth. She had found her home. Only if you promise to finish that story about your uncle and the runaway sheep, she teased, leaning back against him. He laughed, a rich, easy sound. Deal. They walked out of the mill together, hand in hand, into the golden light of the late afternoon. She had come to Oakhaven to strip an asset and had instead been stripped of everything she thought she was. In the ruins of her old life, she had built something that had true value, and found a love she never knew she was searching for. She remembered her desperate promise in the dark and smiled. She had offered to make Lyndon a rich man, never realizing he already was. It was he and his small, fierce family who had shown her what true wealth looked like. He hadn't just saved her from a storm, he had saved her from the cold, empty prison of a life she had built for herself, and led her into the warmth.